Chapter 25 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Your reader is Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Modern Times, by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 25. George Washington, 1732 to 1799. George Washington, familiarly known as the father of his country, was born on a plantation in Virginia called Bridges Creek on February 22, 1732. When he was 3 years old, the house in which he was born was burned down, and the family moved to another plantation on the Rappahannock, opposite Fredericksburg. He was the eldest of 5 children, although he had a half-brother named Lawrence, who was 15 years older than himself. His father died when he was but 11 years of age, but his mother, who was a strong and healthy woman, took up her burden bravely and brought up her family with great care. It is generally admitted that Washington got his manly qualities from his mother. In features and in mental characteristics, he resembled her very closely. After the death of George's father, one of his estates called Mount Vernon, on the Potomac River, was inherited by Lawrence. Lawrence Washington was fond of George, and often invited him to spend his holidays at Mount Vernon. An English nobleman named Lord Fairfax lived near Mount Vernon, and often visited Lawrence Washington. In this way he became acquainted with George. Lord Fairfax owned an immense tract of wild forest land in Virginia. He had never seen it himself, and few white men had ever been on it. Lord Fairfax was an old gentleman, but he took a great liking to George Washington. When he found that the young man understood surveying, he engaged him to survey these lands. When only 16, George entered upon his task. This was quite an undertaking for one so young, but in 3 years the survey was finished, and it was so well done that it stands to this day. Lawrence Washington died in 1752, and in his will he made George guardian to his daughter and heir to Mount Vernon in case of her death. George had now grown to manhood. He was wonderfully strong and athletic, and could outrun, outleap, and outride all the young men of his acquaintance. So fully did he command the confidence of those who knew him that he was appointed to positions of great trust and responsibility. At the age of 23, he was made colonel and commander-in-chief of all the forces raised in Virginia for the defense of the Western Territory against the French. In this French War, as it was called, he received a splendid training, not only in success, but in failure, and confidence in him was greatly increased when men saw how these failures and defeats raised his unconquerable spirit. In a second expedition, Washington was again placed in command of the American troops. The French had built a fort at the point where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers join and form the Ohio, which they called Fort Duquesne. Washington decided to capture this fort, but the French garrison were afraid to risk a battle, so they burned the fort and marched away into Canada. When Washington and his men arrived, they found nothing but smoking ruins, but they took possession of the place in the name of King George. Some time afterward, the English won a great victory over the French at Quebec. This gave them all French America from the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes as far west as the Mississippi, and south to the Gulf of Mexico. At the end of the war, Washington returned to Mount Vernon. In May 1758, Washington was called to Williamsburg to confer with the governor in regard to the condition of the Virginia troops. He traveled there on horseback, accompanied by his servant, and one day he stopped for dinner at the mansion of a hospitable planter. There he was introduced to a lovely young widow, Mrs. Martha Custis. Her manners and conversation were so pleasing to him that he spent the afternoon and evening in her company, and the next morning he rode away a captive to her charms. George Washington and Martha Custis were married on January 6, 1759. The union proved to be a very happy one. She adorned every station to which his greatness called her, and he was tenderly devoted to her till the end of his life. For several years Washington lived the life of a country gentleman. He was very fond of horses and hounds, and often went fox hunting. But, like other people in the American colonies, he was greatly troubled by the unjust way in which the English king and his government were acting. The English Parliament ordered that a tax should be paid upon all the tea brought into New York, Boston, and the other ports of the colonies. As the colonists had no representative in Parliament, they felt that they ought not to be taxed, and when a shipload of tea arrived in Boston, a number of citizens went on board the vessel and threw the chests of tea into the harbor. This was called the Boston Tea Party. Washington hated the tea tax, and he and his friends refused to buy any goods that came from England. A number of men from all the colonies met together in a congress to consider what should be done. They sent a letter to the King of England, begging that they might have the same rights as those of his subjects who were born in England. Quite a number of men in the English Parliament said that the colonists were right. Among these was William Pitt, after whom the city of Pittsburgh was named. But the Parliament was stubborn, and the Americans found that if they were to gain their rights, they could only do so by fighting for them. So they took up arms and entered upon a great struggle for their liberties. The Congress of the Colonies raised an army, and Washington was made commander-in-chief. British troops had already been sent over to fight against the colonists. As Washington was riding from Mount Vernon to Cambridge, Massachusetts, people told him that a battle had taken place between the English soldiers and the colonial militia. His question was, did the militia fight? Yes, was the answer. Then, said Washington, the liberties of the country are safe. On arriving at Cambridge, Washington at once assumed command. The British held the city of Boston, but Washington made up his mind to take it. One cold night in March, he fortified a hill which commanded the city. From its heights he discharged such a shower of shot and shell that the British commander found that Boston was not a safe place for him to stay in, so he took his ships and left the city in Washington's hands. This was a great victory for the colonists, and they were much encouraged. On the 4th of July, 1776, Congress declared that the colonies no longer belonged to Great Britain, but were free and independent. A British fleet and army now arrived from England to capture New York. They landed on Long Island, and a battle was fought in which the Americans were badly defeated. The British rested for a couple of days after the battle, and during that time Washington led the American army across the East River, marched through New York, and on through Harlem to White Plains. There they dug trenches, threw up breastworks, and awaited the British attack. The English commander hesitated to attack them in this strong position, and Washington soon afterward crossed the Hudson into New Jersey. These were dark days for all who were fighting for liberty and independence. On several occasions Washington saved his army only by rapidly retreating from place to place. At Christmas 1777, the main body of the British army were in winter quarters at New York, and the towns of Princeton and Trenton in New Jersey were also held by them. Washington determined to make an advance movement against them. He crossed the Delaware amidst floating ice, marched to Trenton in a driving storm of sleet, and captured the town. He was also successful at Princeton, and Frederick the Great, the most famous soldier of Prussia, declared that Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton were the most splendid gained in the 18th century. He next won a great battle at Monmouth in New Jersey, and after that the outlook began to improve. Benjamin Franklin was then in Paris, and he persuaded the French government to help his countrymen. So a French fleet and an army came over and rendered good service to the American cause. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman, had already come to this country and joined the colonial army. Washington admired him very greatly, and made him a major general. He was a brave man and a brilliant soldier, and will ever be kindly remembered by the American people. In 1781, the main division of the British Army was at Yorktown in Virginia, under the command of Lord Cornwallis. As soon as the French allies arrived, Washington went to see the commander of the fleet, and it was agreed that the French and Americans should unite and make an attack on Cornwallis. The French fleet sailed to Yorktown, and the French and Americans closing in upon the town by land, it was soon besieged on all sides. The British army was so closely cooped up in Yorktown that Cornwallis was finally obliged to surrender, and this victory brought the war to an end. Peace was made with England, and Washington returned to his beautiful home at Mount Vernon, where he would have liked to spend the rest of his life in quiet. But the country still needed his help. Although our country was called the United States of America, the states were not really united. They had joined in the war against England because all were in the same danger, but as soon as the danger was over, they began to disagree among themselves. There were 13 independent states. Each of these states had its own governor, but there was no president over all. There really was no nation, and of course there was no constitution. Washington said there must be a union that would keep the states together in peace as well as in war. Most of the people felt as he did, and so, in 1789, a constitution was drawn up and adopted by the states. This constitution provided that there should be a president elected by the people to be the ruler of the nation, that laws should be made which the people in all the states must obey, and that these laws should be made by Congress and the president. After the Constitution had been adopted, an election was held, and George Washington, being the unanimous choice of his countrymen, became the first president of the United States of America. New York was then capital city of the country, and after his election, Washington went to live there. His journey from Mount Vernon to New York was one long triumphal march. Congress then held its meetings in a hall in Wall Street, and in front of that hall he took the oath to serve the country faithfully and to maintain the Constitution. An immense crowd had gathered to witness this ceremony, and as soon as it was performed they shouted, "God bless George Washington, President of the United States." Bells pealed and cannons roared, and there was great rejoicing all over the land. So well did George Washington rule that when his term of office expired, he was again the choice of the people, and they would have had him elected a third time had not he himself declined the great honor. He wrote a farewell address to the people of the United States, and went back to Virginia to live amid the quiet scenes of Mount Vernon and enjoy a well-earned rest. Not quite 3 years passed when, in December 1799, he took a severe cold as he was riding over his farm in a storm of sleet. He failed very rapidly from the first, and, 2 days later, George Washington, the father of his country, was dead. He was buried at Mount Vernon. The entire nation sincerely mourned the loss of its founder and friend, and the world grieved for the death of one of its grandest heroes. End of Chapter 25. Read by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York.
Of famous men of modern times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 26. Robespierre, 1758 to 1794. A few years after the American Revolution had freed the 13 colonies from the tyranny of George III, the great French Revolution began. This was also a struggle against tyranny, and Americans can scarcely help sympathizing with the French who, for many generations, had been deprived of their just rights. One of the great leaders of the French Revolution was Robespierre. He was born at Arras in France on May 6, 1758. He was left an orphan at the age of 9, and obtained his early education in the schools of his native town through the kindness of a warm-hearted bishop who had known his father. He afterwards entered the college of Louis le Grand in Paris. He was a clever student, and when Louis XVI entered Paris at the beginning of his reign, Robespierre was chosen by vote of his fellow students to present him with an address of welcome. After his graduation in 1781, he was called to the bar, but resigned on account of his reluctance to pronounce sentence of death. Nevertheless, it is said that he was cruel even as a child, and that he took great pleasure in mean little acts that would give pain to others. He appears to have felt, very early in life, a great hatred for people who were wealthy and of high rank. As a youth he talked a great deal about the rights of the lower classes, and the wrong-doings of the upper classes, and he declared that the power of doing so much wrong should be taken away from the king and his nobles. The poor people of France liked to hear such talk, for they had just reason to complain. Many of them came to look upon Robespierre as the champion of their rights, and to place much confidence in his ability to help them. The revolutionists had come to think that the only remedy for their wrongs was the death of King Louis XVI, just as in England Cromwell and his friends, 150 years earlier, had believed that the English people could gain their rights only by the death of Charles I. Robespierre was determined that the king should be executed. He made a speech in which he said that France would be far better off without any king. He then went on to say that happiness and prosperity would return to the country if only Louis could be removed, and that the only way to remove him was to put him to death. Most of the assembly thought that the person of a king was sacred, and that if his life was taken, the curse of God would rest upon those who took it. Robespierre boldly denied this, and the people were delighted with his words. They named him the Incorruptible, and they almost worshipped him. One day, when he was leaving the hall where the meetings of the assembly were held, they placed a crown of oak leaves upon his head, unharnessed the horses from his carriage, and drew him to his home themselves. As they passed along the streets, they cried, "Behold the friend of the people! Behold the defender of liberty!" The revolutionists raised an army of their own, placed a guard around the palace, and made the king a prisoner. Then they brought him to trial and charged him with being the cause of all the troubles that the people of France had suffered during his reign. 3 excellent lawyers were employed to defend him, and they spoke very strongly in his behalf. But on January 16, 1793, this mock court sentenced him to death. After the death of Louis XVI, Robespierre became the absolute master of France, and he was so cruel that the period of his rule has been called the Reign of Terror. People were afraid, when they rose in the morning, that they might be beheaded during the day, and when they went to bed they feared lest assassins might enter their rooms and kill them while they slept. It is stated on good authority that the executions during Robespierre's rule averaged about 30 a day. After a while people began to see that their condition had not improved. Everybody in Paris was extremely unhappy, and some did not hesitate to say that they were worse off under Robespierre than they had been under Louis XVI. As Robespierre himself had taught the peoples that the death of the ruler was the great remedy for their troubles, many persons began to think that it would be the best thing for France if Robespierre himself should be put to death. A conspiracy was formed to bring Robespierre to trial, and one day a bold speaker arose in the Convention and openly blamed him for his cruelty. Robespierre rose from his seat and was about to make a speech in his own defence, but the hall was filled with the cries of "Down with the tyrant! Down with the tyrant!" and he fled from the building in great alarm. In a few moments he was surrounded by the officers of the Convention. As they were about to seize him he tried to kill himself by firing a pistol at his head, but the ball only fractured his lower jaw. Together with 20 of his friends he was executed on the same day on which he was arrested. End of chapter 26. Of famous men of modern times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821. The home of Napoleon Bonaparte for the first 10 years of his life was at Ajaccio on the island of Corsica. When 10 years of age he was sent to a military school. At 16 he entered the army. When France was declared a republic he sided with the revolutionists. Some of the people of Paris did not like the idea of a republic, and about 40,000 of them marched through the streets to attack the Tuileries, where the Republican Convention was sitting. The Convention had learned that an attack was to be made on them, and they had prepared to resist it. They had troops, but they needed a commander. One of the members who knew Napoleon said, "I know just the man you want. He is a little Corsican officer and will not stand upon ceremony." Napoleon was sent for and put in command. He led out their forces and many of the royalists were killed or wounded, and the rest fled. He had done his work well, and the Convention at once gave him a higher position. A French army, sent to attack the Austrians in North Italy, was placed under his command. The soldiers were greatly dissatisfied because their pay was in arrears. Napoleon said to them, "I will lead you into the most fertile fields that the sun shines on. Rich provinces and great cities shall be your reward." The Austrians posted themselves near a town called Lodi, on the bank of the river Adda. A bridge crossed the Adda into the town, and this bridge was first taken. Then Napoleon and General Lannes made a splendid charge and captured the town itself. 4 days later Napoleon entered Milan and compelled that wealthy city to pay him nearly $4,000,000. Mantua was also captured and the palaces of the dukes and nobles were plundered. When peace was made Austria was obliged to surrender Belgium, Corfu, and the Ionian Islands, and to liberate General Lafayette and other Frenchmen held in Austrian prisons. With French aid, republics were established in Switzerland, Naples, and Rome, and Napoleon then said, "If my voice has any influence, England shall never have 1 hour's truce until she is destroyed." But his next campaign was in Egypt, where he was again victorious. The English commander, Nelson, however, destroyed the ships in which the French soldiers were expecting to return, and so Napoleon, leaving 15,000 troops to hold possession of Egypt, marched the remainder of his army into Palestine. He was successful in an attack on Jaffa. Then he proceeded northward to Acre, which was garrisoned by the Turks. After besieging this town for more than 60 days, he was compelled to withdraw. Napoleon then returned to Egypt and found a great Turkish army just about to attack the troops he had left there, but he conquered them in a single battle and once more hastened back to France, where he was warmly welcomed by the people and was the idol of the army. At that time France was governed by 5 men who were called the Directory, or ruling body of France. There was also a Council of 500, something like our House of Representatives. The Directory resigned, and since many of the Council of 500 disliked him, Napoleon had them turned out of office. Napoleon and 2 associates were then made rulers of France, under the title of consuls, and although he was known as the first consul, he was the real governor of the French nation. One of the first things Napoleon did after being made first consul was to write a letter to George III, King of England, proposing that England and France should make peace. The English government replied that the easiest thing for France to do, if she desired peace with the other powers of Europe, would be to restore the royal family to the throne. Napoleon then made his famous attack on Italy, which had been lost to France while he was in Egypt. 60,000 men were ordered to cross the Alps. They were to go by 4 different passes and then to meet in Italy. Cannon had to be dragged over the snow, and sometimes 100 men were required to handle a single large gun. They passed the monastery of St. Bernard and descended into Italy. A desperate battle was fought at Marengo, and after a partial defeat the French were again victorious. The conqueror returned home in triumph, but his enemies attempted to assassinate him by exploding a barrel of gunpowder under his carriage. The carriage, however, had got safely past before the explosion took place. This incident led to giving him still greater power, and Napoleon was from that time considered as the Emperor of the French. In 1801, the very next year after the victory at Marengo, British troops landed in Egypt, and in one short campaign drove the French out of that country. When Napoleon heard that Egypt was lost, he said, "Well, there remains only the descent on Britain," and in a short time 160,000 men were ready to invade England. An immense number of flat-bottomed boats were prepared to carry this force across the Channel. But Lord Nelson was guarding the English coasts by day and by night. Napoleon knew that Nelson's guns would soon sink the boats, and so a treaty of peace was made in 1802, and the struggle with England was again postponed. Napoleon was as great a tyrant as Louis XVI, and he tried to be as tyrannical in foreign countries as he was at home. The people of northern Italy were so alarmed by his victories at Lodi, Mantua, and Marengo that they allowed him to take from them all independence and make their states a province of France. He treated Switzerland in the same way. The peace between France and England lasted but 1 year, and then Napoleon again prepared for an invasion. A large army was assembled in camps along the coasts of France and Holland, but the French were again hindered from sailing by the vigilance of Nelson. The coronation of the Emperor and Empress on May 18, 1804, was a very grand affair, and the French people seemed to be well satisfied with their new rulers. A few months later Napoleon went to Milan and there crowned himself King of Italy with the famous Iron Crown of Charlemagne. This angered the Austrians and Russians, and Russia and England became the allies of Austria. Napoleon continued to wage war until his very name became a terror, and after his great victory at Austerlitz men feared him more and more. At the battle of Jena, where he fought against the Prussians, he was again triumphant, and he carried himself as though he was the master of the world. He divorced his wife Josephine and married Maria Louisa, daughter of the Emperor of Austria. Troubles again arose with Russia, and Napoleon's advisers tried to persuade him not to go to war, but he said, "The states of Europe must be melted into one nation, and Paris must be its capital." The Russian army was only about half as large as that of the French. By a system of carefully arranged retreats it lured Napoleon and his men into the very heart of Russia. Near Moscow a battle was fought which lasted all day, and neither party could claim the victory. Next morning the Russians had disappeared, and the French army entered the city and pillaged it. But so many fires occurred that Napoleon was obliged to leave the city just as the terrible Russian winter began. When the French entered Moscow over 100,000 soldiers answered the roll call, but when they returned to France only 12,000 were alive. It has been well said that the fortunes of Napoleon were buried in the Russian snows. England, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Austria now declared war against him. He was defeated at Leipzig and again driven back into France. The allied armies pursued him, captured Paris, forced him to abdicate, and placed Louis XVIII on the throne. Napoleon was banished to a little island in the Mediterranean called Elba. Louis XVIII tried to govern as his brother had done before the Revolution, and the French again became discontented. When, therefore, the news was heard that Napoleon had escaped from Elba and was again in France, the whole nation broke into the wildest rejoicing, and Napoleon was once more emperor. He marched into Belgium and there fought his last battle. He had a fine army, and the English and Prussian generals, Wellington and Blücher, were equally well equipped. Napoleon managed to get between the English and Prussian armies. He defeated the Prussians on June 16, but in turn was beaten by the English. Then on the heights about Waterloo the decisive battle was fought, June 18, 1815. Both sides fought with great bravery. In front of the English was a sunken road cut into the hill like a ditch, and this was concealed from the French by a hedge. 3,500 of the French cavalry plunged into this ditch, as they rode up rank after rank, and the survivors were compelled to ride over the struggling bodies of their comrades. Then the English, drawn up in solid masses, received the French charge on the points of their bayonets, and at the same time poured a heavy fire into their broken ranks. At about 5 in the afternoon Blücher appeared and united his troops with those of Wellington. Napoleon's famous Old Guard made a charge which Wellington himself said was splendid, but the French army was thrown into confusion and Wellington won the day. A month later Napoleon went on board the Bellerophon, an English man-of-war, and surrendered himself to the captain. He was afterwards taken by the British to an island in the Atlantic Ocean called St. Helena, and was kept a prisoner there until his death in 1821. In 1840 the French government requested that the English allow them to bring his body to France. In Paris the body was received by Louis Philippe, who was then King of France. More than 1 million people gathered in the streets through which the funeral procession passed, and 30,000 were present at the funeral service, which closed with a requiem sung by 300 voices. End of chapter 27.
Of famous men of modern times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Paul Curran in the hills of northern England. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 28. Horatio Nelson, 1758 to 1805. Horatio Nelson was born in 1758. At 12 years of age he asked permission to go to sea with an uncle named Suckling. But as his uncle did not sail that year, he was sent in charge of a friend on a voyage to the West Indies. It was not many days before the sailor boy knew the name of every rope on the ship, and the use of each. He could box the compass, that is, repeat the names of all the 32 points backwards and forwards, and could tell in what direction the ship was sailing. When he returned to England, he was fonder of the sea than ever. Some time after reaching home, he heard that 2 ships of the navy were going to the North Pole, and he obtained permission to go with them. The vessels, after sailing far toward the north, were becalmed. The weather became very cold, and they were surrounded by great fields of ice. One night, while they were frozen up in the ice fields, Nelson and one of his comrades stole away from their ship to attack a huge polar bear. Pretty soon they were missed. But although they were not far away, a thick fog prevented those on board from seeing them. The captain became alarmed. The signal for their return was fired, and Nelson, much disappointed, went back to the ship. Fortunately, a wind soon sprang up from the east, and the current drifted them into clear water. In due time they sighted Old England once more. Nelson's next voyage was to the East Indies, and there he cruised about for 18 months. The hot climate did not agree with him, and he was finally sent home, but on the voyage his health improved so much that when he reached England he was ready to go to sea again. The Spaniards then claimed Central and South America, and England was at war with Spain, so a plan was proposed to seize that part of South America where the canal is now being cut to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. There the Spaniards had 2 forts, and Nelson was sent to capture them. When he got near one of them he leapt ashore from his boat. He alighted on ground so soft that he sank into it and lost his shoes, but this did not stop him. Barefoot he led on his men and took one fort. The other was also soon taken, but the climate of the region was far more deadly than the guns of the Spaniards, and Nelson was obliged to return to England on sick leave. It was 3 months before he was well enough to go to sea again. He was then appointed to the Albemarle, a vessel of 28 guns. This was at the time that George III. Was trying to conquer the American colonies, and Nelson was sent to cruise in the waters of Canada and New England. After the surrender of the British at Yorktown, Nelson wrote home, "I have closed the war without a fortune, but there is not a speck on my character." After the execution of Louis XVI., England, as we have said, was at war with France, and Nelson was put in command of the Agamemnon, a ship of 64 guns. The French, at about this time, took possession of the little island of Corsica on which Napoleon was born. They placed a garrison in a fortified town called Calvi, and the English laid siege to it. The Agamemnon was ordered to aid the land forces, and so Nelson took his men and guns ashore and fought on the land. Calvi was taken, and Corsica was annexed to Great Britain. But for Nelson this battle proved a serious matter. A shot struck the ground near him, and drove some sand and gravel into his eye. He thought at first that no great harm had been done, but the sight of the eye was lost. A short time after this, the English admiral whom Nelson was serving learned that a French fleet of 22 vessels with over 16,000 men was not far off. The English fleet consisted of only 15 ships, with half as many men as the French. However, when they came in sight of the French, they gave chase. The Agamemnon, with her 64 guns, followed a French frigate of 84, called the Ça-Ira. Nelson was all alone, for the other ships of the English fleet were several miles distant. Near the Ça-Ira were 3 other French vessels of 130 guns. Nelson sailed close up to the big ship, and when about 100 yards astern of her, suddenly ordered the helm to be put to the right, and fired his whole broadside, that is, all the guns on one side of his vessel. Then he ordered the helm hard to the left, and started after the Frenchmen again, and when he came near he turned and fired another broadside. This he did again and again, for 2 hours and a quarter, always keeping out of range of the enemy's guns. But so many other French ships came upon the scene that, fearing that they would prove too much for him, he sailed away and joined the English fleet. Next morning the French fleet was again discovered about 5 miles away, but the Ça-Ira had been so much injured that she had to be towed, and was only about 3½ miles distant. Nelson attacked both the Ça-Ira and the vessel which was towing her. The French fought gallantly, but the guns of the Agamemnon were so well aimed that the 2 French ships lost about 300 men. Then both of them lowered their colours and surrendered. Spain was now in alliance with France, and fighting against England. Nelson attacked a Spanish frigate, and after conquering her, had the captain brought on board his ship. Then 4 more Spanish vessels hove in sight, and Nelson prudently sailed away. As soon as he reached a port, he gave the Spanish captain his liberty, and sent him to his friends under a flag of truce. Not long after this, the English fleet of 19 vessels was signalled to keep in line of battle all night. At daybreak, a Spanish fleet of 38 vessels was in sight. Sir John Jervis, finding that they were much scattered, ordered the English ships to sail in among them and attack them. Nelson was so much afraid that the Spanish ships would escape, that he was soon engaged with 7 Spanish vessels, which had in all about 600 guns. Fortunately, 2 British vessels came up to the assistance of Nelson's ship. Both these ships were damaged by shots from the guns of the Spaniards, but at length Nelson managed to steer alongside one of the Spanish vessels, called the St. Nicholas, and he and his men boarded her. The Spanish officers took refuge in the cabin, and fired at the boarding party through the windows, but the English forced the door, and the Spaniards surrendered their swords to Nelson. Another Spanish vessel, called the San Joseph, lay close to the St. Nicholas, and the English, led by Nelson himself, forced her to surrender. For his great bravery Nelson was made a Knight of the Bath, and so became Sir Horatio Nelson. His next adventure was an attack upon Teneriffe, and there he was so severely injured in the right arm that he was obliged to have it amputated. After recovering from his wound, he was again placed in command. His vessel was the Vanguard. Napoleon was preparing his great expedition for the conquest of Egypt. Nelson sailed in search of the French, and defeated them in the great battle of the Nile. In this engagement he was also wounded, but not so seriously as was at first supposed. After the battle he again returned to England. When he entered the harbor of Yarmouth, every ship in port hoisted her colours, and in London he was drawn in triumph through the streets, and presented by the city council with a gold-hilted sword studded with diamonds. Napoleon was now at the height of his power. Denmark, Sweden, and Russia had formed an alliance with France to try and take from England her sovereignty of the seas. The hostile fleets met off Copenhagen. Part of the English fleet was under Nelson's command. The admiral who was chief in command was at some distance when the battle began. Thinking that the engagement was going against them, he gave the signal to cease firing, and the officer on Nelson's ship, whose duty it was to watch for signals, reported this to Nelson. Nelson put his spyglass to his blind eye, and looking toward the admiral's ship, said, "I really do not see the signal. Keep mine flying for closer battle." Soon white flags were flying from the mastheads of many of the Danish vessels. Nelson had disobeyed orders, but he had gained the victory, and the enemy's fleet was disabled. In 1804, France induced Spain to join her in war against England, and the French and Spanish fleets sailed to the West Indies to attack the English and take possession there. But they returned to Europe, and Nelson, learning that they were at Cadiz, went there to meet them. Soon after his arrival, one of his frigates, on the lookout, gave the signal that the French and Spanish fleet were coming out of port. Just before they went into battle, Nelson wrote a remarkable prayer and his last wishes. Then he ordered the famous signal to be made to the fleet. England expects every man to do his duty. The French had some Tyrolese riflemen on one of their ships, and a ball from one of their rifles struck Nelson on the shoulder. He fell. When taken up, he said to his captain, "They have done for me at last, Hardy. My backbone is shot through." He knew that his wound was fatal, and when carried to the cockpit, told the surgeon to attend to the others, "For," said he, "you can do nothing for me." About an hour after he was wounded, Captain Hardy came to see him. "Well, Hardy," said he, "how goes the day with us?" "Very well," said Hardy. 10 ships have struck." In less than an hour the captain returned, and taking Nelson's hand, congratulated him on having gained a complete victory. Presently the dying man said, "Kiss me, Hardy." Hardy knelt down and kissed his cheek, and Nelson said, "Now I am satisfied. Thank God, I have done my duty." These words he repeated several times, and they were his last. Thus Admiral Nelson, perhaps the greatest of England's naval commanders, died on his good ship Victory, in Trafalgar Bay, on October 21st, 1805. His body was carried back to England, and was buried with great pomp in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MCY. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haaren in A.B. Poland. Chapter 29. Tadeusz Kosciuszko. Tadeusz Kosciuszko, 1746 to 1817. Americans will never cease to honor the memory of the Polish patriot, Tadeusz Kosciuszko. In his early manhood he was one of the noble band of liberty-loving foreigners who came to the United States and aided American patriots in their struggle for independence. Kosciuszko was born in Poland in 1746, after a long and thorough course of study in the best military schools of Europe. He was appointed a captain in the Polish army. When the American Revolution began, he determined to take part in it. He came to the United States and sought General Washington, who was commander-in-chief of the American army. "General," he said, when he stood before Washington, "I have come to offer myself as a volunteer to fight for American independence." "You are heartily welcome, Captain," replied Washington, warmly shaking the hand of Kosciuszko. "The patriot cause has need of the services of every one who is willing to aid it. What can you do?" "Try me," said Kosciuszko modestly. Washington smiled. "I will try you, Captain," he said cordially, "and I do not doubt that you will perform valuable service." Kosciuszko was appointed colonel of engineers, and soon showed by his skill in constructing fortifications that he could indeed render valuable service to the American army. He was subsequently made one of Washington's staff officers, and served with the great commander for some time. "Never have I known better or more faithful service from any one," said Washington once, when speaking of Kosciuszko's work as a staff officer. "He was prompt, diligent, full of enthusiasm, while at the same time he was a man of large education and accomplishments. I regarded him almost as a younger brother, and trusted him with my most important plans." Toward the close of the war, Kosciuszko was honored with the public thanks of the Continental Congress for his gallant deeds. He was appointed brigadier general, and for some months commanded a large force of the American army. When the Revolution ended, Kosciuszko went back to Poland, proud to have taken part in the patriotic struggle. His countrymen welcomed him home with enthusiasm, and later he was made major general in the Polish army. In 1791 the Poles were forced to resist an invasion of their country by the Russians and Prussians. Kosciuszko took part in the war, and on 2 occasions by skillful management saved the Polish force from entire destruction. At the Battle of Lubyanka, with only about 4,000 men, he kept at bay a Russian army of 20,000, and finally made his retreat without great loss. The Poles were generally outnumbered by the Russians, and they fought gallantly, but they were completely overpowered. Russia and Prussia both annexed large parts of Poland. These annexations is known as the Second Partition of Poland. The first partition had taken place 20 years before, when Austria, Russia, and Prussia each took parts of the little kingdom. In 1794 the Poles were so angry at the loss of their country that they took up arms once more. A revolt was secretly planned, and on a certain day in the spring of 1794 Kosciuszko suddenly appeared in the city of Krakow. "The Russians must be driven from Poland. They must not rule our fair land," said Kosciuszko to those of his countrymen who assembled at his call. "We can free ourselves from Russian slavery if we will fight." The Poles hastily armed themselves, many with nothing but scythes, and advanced to meet the Russian army. After a sharp contest, the enemy was driven out of Krakow. A week later, at Ratzlawice, a Polish army of 5,000, led by Kosciuszko, routed a great force of Russians and returned triumphantly to Krakow. The rebellion went on for several months with some success. On October 10th, 1794, an immense force of Russians advanced against the Poles. The little army of patriots numbered only 4,000. The Poles were defeated with heavy loss, and Kosciuszko, fighting desperately, fell from his horse severely wounded. He was made prisoner by the Russians and taken to St. Petersburg, where he suffered a rigorous imprisonment. The Russian general Suvorov captured Warsaw, and the Kingdom of Poland came to an end. For now Russia, Prussia, and Austria took to themselves all that remained of the Polish territory. When Kosciuszko had been in confinement 2 years, the Tsar gave him his liberty. "You are an enemy of Russia," said the Tsar to him, "but you have shown great heroism, and I cannot help admiring a brave man." The Tsar, seeing that Kosciuszko had no sword, offered him one. "I have no need of a sword," said Kosciuszko. "I have no country now to defend." Immediately after his release from the Russian prison, Kosciuszko went to England and then came to the United States. The Americans received him with great honor, and Congress gave him a liberal pension for his services in the Revolutionary War. For some years afterwards he lived in France. Toward the close of his life he made his home in Switzerland, where he engaged into agricultural pursuits. He died in 1817 in consequence of a fall from a horse. His body was taken to Cracow and buried in the cathedral near the graves of other Polish patriots. After the burial, the Polish people brought earth from all the battlefields on which Kosciuszko had fought for Poland, and erected near Cracow a great mound 150 feet high in honor of their hero. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 30. Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, was the son of poor parents, and his childhood and youth were full of trial and hardship. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a pioneer farmer in Kentucky, and there in a one-room log cabin of the poorer sort, Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809. His mother was Nancy, the daughter of Joseph Hanks, a neighbor who was also trying to earn a livelihood out of the soil. Abraham had also one sister, of whom not much has been recorded. As there was little to encourage his stay in Kentucky, Abraham's father moved into Indiana and built a log cabin in the midst of the forest at Pigeon Creek. Here most of Lincoln's boyhood was passed. In 1818, Mrs. Lincoln died, and Abraham Lincoln was left motherless. 18 months later, his father married Mrs. Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow who had been a neighbor in Kentucky. She was a good woman, and treated Abraham with the same care and tenderness which she showed to her own children. Abraham Lincoln formed a strong attachment for his stepmother, which lasted all through his life. She was really able to do more for him than his own mother had been. He was not only better clothed and better fed, but he also had considerable help in his struggle for an education. By the time he was 10, he was working hard to help his father to clear some land and turn a little piece of the forest into a farm. He had little or no schooling. He once said later on in life that he did not think that all his schooling as a lad amounted to more than 6 months. He learned to write by using a charred stick for a pencil and a piece of board for a slate. There were no books in his home excepting a Bible, a catechism, and a spelling book. But he would walk miles to borrow a book, and he read with great care everything that he could find. He thus gathered a store of information that was of service to him throughout his wonderful career. At 16 years of age he had almost reached the height of 6 feet 4 inches, for which he was noted in after years. His bodily strength was very great, and his services were very much in demand. He did everything he could to help his parents. In 1830 the Lincoln family moved to Illinois, and from that time their fortunes began to improve. Lincoln was now 21. One who knew him well at that time thus describes his personal appearance. He was tall, angular, and ungainly, and wore trousers made of flaxen tow, cut tightly at the ankles and loosely at the knees. He was very poor, but was welcome in every house in the neighborhood. He built a flatboat with his father's consent and carried a load of farm produce down the river to market. It was on this trip that he earned his first dollar by carrying 2 gentlemen and their trunks out to a steamer on the Ohio, a fact of which he was very proud and of which he often spoke in after years. He afterwards made other trips as a boatman, and was very successful in them. It was on one of these trips that he witnessed, in New Orleans, the brutality of the slave trade. This led him to say, "If ever I get a chance to hit that institution, I'll hit it hard." He next entered the employ of a Mr. Offutt, who put him in charge of a general store in New Salem. While tending this store, Lincoln once sold to a woman goods for which she paid the amount of $2 6¼ He discovered later that a mistake had been made, and that the store owed the customer the 6¼ After he had closed the store that night, he walked several miles in the darkness to return the amount. At another time a woman bought a pound of tea. Lincoln discovered the next morning that a smaller weight was on the scales. He at once weighed out the remainder and walked some distance before breakfast to deliver it. It was by such deeds as these that he earned the name of Honest Abe. He gained the goodwill of his neighbors, who called upon him to settle their disputes, and always found him to be fair and upright in his decisions. Misfortune overtook Mr. Offutt, and Lincoln entered the service of the state of Illinois in what is known as the Black Hawk War. He was elected captain of the company, but neither he nor his men were called upon to do any actual fighting. At the close of the war he returned to New Salem, and was urged to become a member of the legislature of Illinois, but he failed to be elected. Like Washington, he took up the business of a surveyor. In 1833 he was made postmaster of New Salem. In the following year, 1834, another election of the members of the state legislature took place, and this time he was successful and became a member for Sangamon County. The 2 political parties were then known as the Democrats and the Whigs, and Lincoln belonged to the Whigs. He was still so poor that he was obliged to borrow money with which to purchase suitable clothing before he could take his seat in the House. His entering the legislature was an important event in his life. The capital of the state was soon afterwards changed from Vandalia to Springfield, and Lincoln, who was rapidly rising into fame, took up the study of law. As a lawyer he was decidedly successful. He formed several partnerships with lawyers of eminence, and his days of biting poverty were over. He still continued his general studies and became one of the best informed men in the state. He gave his first legal fee to his stepmother in the shape of 160 acres of land, in memory of her great kindness to him as a boy. In November 1842, Abraham Lincoln married Miss Mary Todd of Lexington, Kentucky, and the next 10 years were the happiest of his whole life. In 1846 he was elected a member of the United States Congress. He took his seat in the House of Representatives at Washington on December 6th of that year. His first important speech in Congress was one in which he denounced the war then being carried on between the United States and Mexico, a speech in which he dealt the pro-slavery party a severe blow. At the end of his first term in Congress, Mr. Lincoln determined not to seek re-election. He therefore returned to Springfield and resumed the practice of law. When in 1854 a bill was passed which put aside the Missouri Compromise and gave greater powers to the friends of slavery, Lincoln again entered politics. He became a candidate for the Illinois legislature and was elected. Mr. Stephen A. Douglas was then at the height of his power, and was bitterly opposed to Lincoln. In 1860, with Douglas as his most formidable competitor, Mr. Lincoln was elected president, and in February 1861 he left Springfield for Washington and was duly inaugurated in March of that year. In the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, the South feared the institution of slavery was in the gravest danger, and they put forth every possible effort for its defense. Some of the Southern states voted to secede from the Union. Fort Sumter was fired upon, and the terrible Civil War began. Lincoln called for men and readily obtained them. It is to the honor of Mr. Douglas that when he saw the real danger in which the country stood, he acknowledged himself in the wrong, and became one of Lincoln's friends and supporters. This war, sometimes called the War of the Union, lasted from 1861 to 1865. It was the saddest event in the history of our land, and every American boy and girl should make a careful study of its details from the fall of Fort Sumter to the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox. These were trying days for President Lincoln, and at times his sufferings were intense. But he never flinched from what he felt to be his duty, and he was warmly supported by the generals, the army, and the people of the North. During the progress of the war, after due warning, he issued his famous Emancipation Proclamation, and on January 1st, 1863, most of the slaves in the South were declared free. In 1864, the year before the close of the war, Abraham Lincoln was again elected president, and on March 4th, 1865, he entered upon his second term of office. His majority at his second election was the largest ever given to any president up to that time. When the war closed, there was great rejoicing, and on April 11th, 2 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln made a speech in Congress in which he strongly urged that the states which had seceded should be treated with leniency and restored to their proper relations to the central government as quickly and as quietly as possible. On April 14, 1865, the 4th anniversary of the fall of Fort Sumter, a general holiday was observed, and in the evening the President attended a special performance at Ford's Theatre. During the progress of the performance, a retired actor gained access to the President's box, and, placing a pistol over Lincoln's chair, shot him through the head. The assassin escaped amid the general confusion, but was discovered a few days later in Lower Maryland while hiding in a barn. He refused to surrender and was shot dead by one of the soldiers who had been sent to capture him. End of Chapter 30. Recording by Rhonda Fetterman.
'31, A Famous Man of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MCY. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 31. Garibaldi. Garibaldi, 1807 to 1882. Giuseppe Garibaldi, a descendant of an old family of Lombards of North Italy, was born in Nice on July 4, 1807. At an early age he became an expert swimmer, and it is recorded that while still a lad he saved several persons from drowning. He had an excellent mother, and his love for her was both tender and true, and she seems to have been instrumental in developing in him that strong patriotic feeling which formed the leading feature in his character. It was under the direction of his mother, with the assistance of the village priest as a schoolmaster, that he received his education. His father was a seaman, and young Garibaldi accompanied him on several of his voyages, particularly to Rome and Constantinople. By the time Garibaldi reached the age of 24, he had become warmly interested in the revolutionary movements of young Italy. His interest was greatly quickened through his becoming acquainted with Mazzini, who was just then preparing to invade Italy by sea. The effort was unsuccessful, and Garibaldi hastily left the country and thus found himself an exile at the very beginning of his career. He took refuge in Marseille, and afterwards joined the French navy. As soon as he could get himself free from his entanglements, he started on a sea voyage, and in 1836 we find him in Rio de Janeiro, where he remained for about 12 years. These years were filled with romantic adventures, from some of which he barely escaped with his life. Rio Grande do Sul, one of the states of Brazil, possessing a vast territory, was at war with the Brazilian emperor, and Garibaldi threw in his lot with the revolutionists. He first took command of a privateer, a small boat with only 12 men as crew, but a little later he was successful in seizing as a prize a much larger and better equipped vessel, and although not always successful in his encounters with the Brazilians, he began to make himself felt as one of the factors to be dealt with in the war. He passed over into the Argentine territory, and there fell into the hands of a brutish Spanish-American who struck him across the face with a horsewhip, and who also caused him to suffer several hours of torture on the rack, after which he was cast into a dungeon. Through the kindness of Madame Allemande, whom Garibaldi afterwards spoke of as an angel of charity, his sufferings were not so intense as they otherwise might have been. Shortly afterwards, through the intervention of the governor, he escaped from his tormentor. On leaving the Argentine territory, he crossed over again into Rio Grande and devoted himself anew to the cause of the revolutionists. This time he met with better success, fighting many battles, sometimes with only a handful of men. The difficulties he met with were tremendous, but he never lost his courage, and showed so much skill and such strong personality as gave great authority to his counsels. He also softened the stern discipline under which the soldiers had fretted for years, and this made him popular with the army. In a hurricane off the coast of Santa Catarina he was wrecked, and while detained there he met Anita, the talented woman who became his wife. She was a woman of heroic mould, and proved herself both true and helpful in all the hardships which befell him. After the defeat of the revolutionists at the Battle of Las Austras, Garibaldi seemed to have grown discouraged as to the outcome of the war. He therefore bade farewell to his friends at Rio Grande, and settled for a while in Montevideo. At Montevideo he became a teacher of mathematics in one of the city schools. But the life of a teacher was too tame for a man of his adventurous spirit, and he soon gave up his position and again entered upon the life of a soldier. Some men who had become jealous of his successes in Rio Grande now plotted to have him assassinated, but in this they failed. He was then put in charge of a small squadron, and sent out to meet a much superior force, in the hope that he might be destroyed. But he won such glory in the Battle of San Antonio as to earn for himself the proud title of the hero of Montevideo. Through all his wanderings and adventures, his heart remained true to the cause of his native country, and after an absence of over 12 years, he decided to return to Italy. With great difficulty he procured the money for his voyage, and he landed at Nice with his wife and a few faithful comrades in 1848. On his arrival, Garibaldi offered his services to the Italian government, but they were refused. Finally, the government of Lombardy gave him command of a small body of volunteers. When Rome was attacked by the French, the Italians, regardless of party, gathered the forces about Garibaldi and drove the French back. But the Italians suffered a terrible defeat in a 3-month siege of Rome a little later on, and many valuable lives were lost. The French took possession of the city, and Garibaldi, with a few devoted volunteers, set out to join the attack then being made on Austria. He and his followers were met on all sides by the overwhelming forces of Austria, and were compelled to disband and flee to the woods. Garibaldi sought shelter for his brave wife Anita, but she was unable to endure the hardships which followed, and died in the arms of her husband. Our heartbroken hero again became a wanderer. A friend supplied him with means to reach Tunis, and obtained from him a pension, which he gladly accepted. Garibaldi again crossed the ocean, this time to the United States. He became a successful businessman in New York, where he remained until his return to Europe in 1855. When he reached home, he purchased a part of the islet of Caprera on the coast of Sardinia, and built a little home which he called the Hermitage. 4 years later he was again called to defend the cause of Italy. He was given command of a regiment, and again went forth to meet the Austrians, whom he defeated at Varese. He continued in the service until the Peace of Villafranca, to which Napoleon was a party, and this treaty brought the long struggle for Italian independence to a successful close. Victor Emmanuel was now on the throne of Italy, and Garibaldi, who was popularly known as the hero of the red shirt, was warmly welcomed by him. It was in Victor Emmanuel that the hopes of the patriots now centered for the freedom of Italy, and they were not disappointed, for by the wise policy of Count Cavour, the Prime Minister, and the many victories of Garibaldi, it was established on a firm basis. After meeting Victor Emmanuel and hailing him as king, Garibaldi retired to his hermitage, but a great part of Italy still longed to possess Rome as its capital. The French upheld the power of the Pope, but the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 caused France to withdraw her troops from Rome. When the French Republic was established, Victor Emmanuel was officially told that France would no longer uphold the papal power, and the Italian government informed the Pope that Rome would thereafter be considered a part of the Kingdom of Italy. On July 2nd, 1872, Victor Emmanuel took up his residence in Rome, and the Palace of the Vatican became the Pope's place of residence. In 1875, Garibaldi became a member of the Italian Parliament. Titles and honors were offered to him, but he declined to accept them. His health was rapidly failing, so he retired again to his hermitage, where he died on June 2nd, 1882, at the age of 75. End of chapter 31.
Famous Men of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Modern Times by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 32. William Ewart Gladstone, 1809 to 1898. William Ewart Gladstone was born of Scotch parents, and he was one of the very few Scotchmen who have taken a prominent part in British statecraft. He was sent to the great public school at Eton when 12 years of age. There he was always noted for his good behavior and for his regular attendance at the chapel services. It is also recorded of him that he could recite more verses of Scripture than any other boy in the school. The character of Mr. Gladstone is very hard to analyze because of its many-sidedness, and for that reason he was often misunderstood and lost many friends. He graduated from Christ Church College, Oxford, when 22 years of age, having won the highest honors the college could bestow. An account of his appearance, published at the time of his graduation, says, "In features he is handsome, his face is bold and masculine, his eyes are of piercing lustre, and his hair, which he tosses back in debate, is like a lion's mane. He speaks 5 languages, is an excellent tenor singer, is on more than speaking terms with many of the greatest men in England, and besides all this he is rich in English gold." His influence at college was so abiding that Cardinal Manning has said that there was less wine drunk at Oxford during the 40s than would have been the case if Gladstone had not been there in the 30s. It appears to have been his intention to become a clergyman of the English Church, and he studied with this object in view. His father had other plans for him and half forced him into politics, so that immediately on leaving college he ran for Parliament, was elected, and at once made his influence felt in the House of Commons. For more than 60 years thereafter he was one of the powers to be reckoned with on all questions connected with the English government. At 33 years of age he was a member of the British Cabinet, but 3 years later his absolute honesty compelled him to resign from the ministry. His opponents said Gladstone is an extinct volcano, but they were continually discovering that a volcano is a difficult thing to subdue. In his home life he was gentle, amiable, and hospitable. His social instincts were large and his disposition was kindly. He was always true to his friends, and they revered him to a point little short of idolatry. He delivered his maiden speech in Parliament on a subject connected with the great movement for the emancipation of the West Indian slaves, but he seemed to have confined himself mainly to a defence of the manner in which his father's estates were managed, the course of the debate having brought out some charges against the management of the elder Gladstone's possessions in one of the West Indian islands. In January 1835 Sir Robert Peel appointed Gladstone to the office of a junior Lord of the Treasury. In the next year Peel, who was quick to appreciate the great abilities and the sound commercial knowledge of his new recruit, gave him the important post of Under Secretary for the Colonies. Peel went out of office very soon after he had made Mr. Gladstone Under Secretary for the Colonies. Lord John Russell brought forward a series of motions on the subject of the Irish Church, and Peel, being defeated, resigned. It is almost needless to say that Gladstone went with him. In 1841 Sir Robert Peel again came into power, and Gladstone was given a seat in his cabinet as President of the Board of Trade. At the general election in 1847, Mr. Gladstone, still accepted as a Tory, was chosen one of the representatives of the University of Oxford. Up to the time of the movement which led to the abolition of the Corn Laws, Mr. Gladstone had been a Tory of a rather old-fashioned school. The Corn Law agitation probably first set him thinking over the possible defects of the social and legislative system, and showed him the necessity for reform at least in one direction. By the death of Sir Robert Peel in 1850, Mr. Gladstone lost a trusted leader and a dear friend. But the loss of his leader brought Gladstone himself more directly to the front. It was not until after Peel's death that he compelled the House of Commons and the country to recognise in him a supreme master of parliamentary debate. The first really great speech made by Mr. Gladstone in Parliament was made in the debate on Mr. Disraeli's budget in the winter of 1852, the first session of the new Parliament. Mr. Disraeli sat down at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then Mr. Gladstone rose to reply to him. Most men in the House, even on the opposition side, were filled with the belief that it would be impossible to make any real impression on the House after such a speech as that of Mr. Disraeli. Long before Mr. Gladstone had concluded, every one admitted that the effect of Mr. Disraeli's speech had been outdone, and Gladstone became fully recognized as the man of the hour, a man to rank with Bolingbroke, Pitt, and Fox. With that speech began the long parliamentary duel between these two great masters of debate, Mr. Gladstone and Mr. Disraeli, which was carried on for 24 years. On the fall of the short-lived Tory administration, Lord Aberdeen came into office. He formed the famous coalition ministry. Lord Palmerston took what most people would have thought the uncongenial office of Home Secretary. Mr. Gladstone, who with other of the Peelites, as they were called, had joined the new administration and was made Chancellor of the Exchequer. His speech on the introduction of his first budget was waited for with great interest, but none of those who listened to it would have wished it to be shortened by a sentence. A budget speech by Mr. Gladstone was a triumph in the realm of fine arts. The Crimean War broke up the coalition ministry, but the year 1859 saw Lord Palmerston back in office, and Mr. Gladstone in his old place as Chancellor of the Exchequer. The death of Lord Palmerston in 1865 called Lord Russell to the position of Prime Minister, and made Mr. Gladstone leader of the House of Commons. Mr. Gladstone's mind had long been turning in the direction of an extension, or rather expansion, of the suffrage. It was assumed by every one that Lord Russell and Mr. Gladstone, being now at the head of affairs, a Reform Bill would be sure to come. It did come in 1866, a very moderate and cautious bill, enlarging the area of the franchise in boroughs and counties. The Conservative party opposed it. The bill was defeated, and the Liberal statesman went out of office. Somewhere about this time the attention of Mr. Gladstone began to be attracted to the condition of Ireland. The distress and distracted state of Ireland, the unceasing popular agitation and discontent, and the Fenian insurrection, with its contemplated attack on Chester Castle, led Mr. Gladstone to the conviction that the time had come when statesmanship must seek, through Parliament, for some process of remedy. In 1868 the Liberals returned to power, and Mr. Gladstone became Prime Minister. In his first session of government he disestablished and disendowed the State Church in Ireland. In the next session he passed a measure which for the first time recognized the right of the Irish tenant to the value of the improvements he had himself made at his own cost and labour. Never, probably, was there such a period of energetic reform in almost every direction as that which set in when Mr. Gladstone became Prime Minister. It was also at this time, and quite largely through Mr. Gladstone's efforts, that the first system of national education was established in England. The Ballot Act was passed for the protection of the voters, so that they might vote as they wished, without having to suffer painful consequences after the election was over. These two measures have been of very great value to the English people, and they prize him very highly. For a while Mr. Gladstone occupied himself in literary and historical studies, and published quite a number of essays and pamphlets. But even in his literary career, Mr. Gladstone would appear to have always kept glancing at the House of Commons, as Charles V in his monastery kept his eyes on the world of politics outside. The atrocious conduct of the Turkish officials in Bulgaria aroused his generous anger, and he flung down his books and rushed out from his study to preach a crusade against the Ottoman power in Europe. It was an unpropitious hour at which to return to office. There were troubles in Egypt, there was an impending war in the Sudan and in South Africa. There was something like an agrarian revolution going on in Ireland, and the Home Rule party in the House of Commons was under new, resolute, and uncompromising leadership. He was out of office in a few months, and then the general elections came on. These elections were to give the first opportunity to the newly made voters under Mr. Gladstone's latest Reform Act, and these voters sent him back into office, and he once again took the helm and strove to guide the ship of state through the troubled seas, which beat upon it from every point of the compass. Under his leadership a Home Rule Bill for Ireland was passed by the Commons, in spite of most bitter opposition. It was rejected almost unanimously by the House of Lords. But time was beginning to tell upon the grand old man, for he was now 84 years old, and felt himself unequal to the gigantic struggle of the hour. He therefore resigned his offices and retired into private life in March 1894. Mr. Gladstone sat in Parliament for 63 years, and for 26 years he was the leader of his party. The three most notable acts of his political career were the disestablishment of the Irish Church in 1866, his opposition to England's support of Turkey in 1876, and his work in favour of Home Rule for Ireland in 1886, while he had also much to do with the two great Reform Bills of 1855 and 1884. Mr. Gladstone affords a splendid example of a man who devoted his life to the political service of his country, and still preserved his moral and religious character. He died at his home, Haaren Castle, in 1898. End of chapter 32.
Chapter 33. A Famous Man of Modern Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MCY. Famous Men of Modern Times by John Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 33. Count von Bismarck. Count von Bismarck, 1815 to 1898. Otto Eduard Leopold Bismarck was born on the estate of Schönhausen, near Stendal, in Prussian Saxony, on April 1st, 1815. His ancestors had been famous both in war and in diplomatic circles for several generations. They were descended from the Prussian nobility, and his grandfather had held the office of Privy Councillor to Frederick the Great. At the age of 6 he entered a boarding school in Berlin, where he tells us they served elastic meat, always accompanied with parsnips. When he was 12, he came under the influence of Dr. Prevost, who did much for the broadening of his mind and the strengthening of his character. During his vacations, he developed his powers of endurance by participating in many sports, and then, at the age of 17, he entered the University of Göttingen for the purpose of studying law. As a student, he was not a brilliant success. He did not hold himself strictly to the prescribed studies of his course. During the first year of his university life, he fought 28 duels. In one of these he was wounded on the left cheek, and he carried the scar left by the wound all through his later life. On leaving Göttingen in 1833, he went to Berlin. After a couple of years' study there, he received the diploma necessary to enable him to enter upon a professional career, but decided to devote his time to the care of his estate. When 32 years of age, he was elected a member of the General Diet. He at once began to impress the people with his great tact and forethought, and each year their confidence in him was deepened. He exercised a large amount of outward patience toward those who opposed him, but was simply awaiting the time when he could strike such decisive blows as would assure his ultimate success. This was one of the marked characteristics of his whole career. It would seem that from the very beginning of his political life the people decided to take him just as he was, and they grew to be very fond of him. His aim was to preserve the peace of Europe. With great skill he avoided trouble both for himself and for his countrymen, and he quickly made for himself a name both at home and abroad. His early life was lived among the Prussians, but he became objectionable to them because of his desire for power. At the first Prussian Parliament in which he sat, in 1847, he said in one of his speeches, "Away with the cities, I hope to see them all levelled to the ground." And these words had in them the ring of that social hatred which he always showed toward the liberal class. He followed very closely in the footprints of Garibaldi in the struggle for the unity and independence of Italy, and it would seem to be equally certain that Bismarck's methods were also followed by Garibaldi on several occasions. There were many non-Prussians who greatly admired Bismarck on account of his endeavors for German unity, but the people in the southern part of Germany were equally strong in their dislike for him. Through many discouragements, he continued to press calmly onward in what he felt to be the path of duty, and for other 20 years his career was unusually prosperous. At different periods, Bismarck was appointed ambassador to Austria, Russia, and France. In 1862, at the age of 47, he became minister of the king's household, and also minister of foreign affairs in Prussia. The brother of the king was very much opposed to Bismarck's plan of excluding Austria from a place in the remodeled German Confederation. Even the queen looked upon this measure with fear, for she had been brought up under the principles of constitutional government. The Princess Royal of England also showed a bitter spirit toward him, for she was anxious for the future of her children. But King William was a true friend to him, and Bismarck never regretted that he had placed confidence in the king's faithfulness. In May 1866, a fanatic by the name of Kohn attempted to kill Bismarck, and there were some who openly expressed the regret that the attempt was not successful. Bismarck devoted his efforts to two main purposes: to transfer Austria to a position in the East, and to give the Germany political unity under Prussia. He seems to have felt that if Austria were removed from her position within the federal body, she would become a permanent ally of the new Germany, and that, in time, it would be better for her own interests and for those of Europe. Bismarck had two powerful antagonists in the persons of Napoleon III of France and Earl Russell of England, and some thought he was working to bring about the union of France and Russia. But he was only measuring the men with whom he had to do, and studying out the plans he had in mind for the strengthening and consolidation of the German Empire. And it has well been said, it was Bismarck's constant misfortune to be misunderstood. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 71, France was severely humbled. But what was of the most interest to Bismarck was that it caused such national enthusiasm among the Germans that at Versailles, in January 1871, the new German Empire was established with the King of Prussia as its leader. It was also at this time that Bismarck was raised to the rank of prince. On May 10, 1871, at the Treaty of Frankfurt, France was obliged to give to Germany the province of Alsace, the greater part of Lorraine, and to pay an indemnity of 5 billion francs. Bismarck now paid close attention to the interests of the fatherland. Germany was a federation, not greatly admired by some of the German people themselves, but accepted because it avoided making any radical changes in political affairs. Under Bismarck's skillful management, it had been made so strong a power that war with France was no longer dreaded. Germany is also indebted to Bismarck for its colonial policy, and although there are but few German colonial ports, they command a very large trade. But it required all his tact and perseverance to make the people see the advantages which this policy would bring them. After the death of William I, Prince Frederick ascended the throne, but he lived only a short time. When William II came into power, it was soon apparent that the Emperor and the Chancellor were not in accord, and Bismarck resigned his office on March 20th, 1890, and retired to private life. The Emperor presented him with the Dukedom of Lauenburg, and he took great interest in all the affairs of the German nation until his death in 1898. End of chapter 33.